Well, thanks for coming, everybody. My name is William Lindsay. I'm the Director of the Office for Aboriginal Peoples at Simon Fraser University. We want to acknowledge the traditional territories of the Coast Salish peoples, particularly the Squamish, Tsleil-Waututh, and Musqueam peoples, on whose shared traditional territory our presentation is taking place tonight. So we're very honored to have a special guest tonight. I was originally going to do this presentation by myself, showing the video clip and then having a good discussion afterwards, but Mr. Duncan McHugh, adjunct professor at UBC and also a reporter with CBC's National, was able to come by tonight. I go back a few years with Duncan. He recently published an article on the CBC National News website, and it was entitled, "What It Takes for Aboriginal People to Make the News." I don't know if any of you had a chance to read it, but I found it particularly engrossing and fascinating, and so Duncan's going to discuss that thereafter. Just a few points I want to make from this particular presentation here. You notice some of the myths and the stereotypes that were predominantly mentioned in here, but have been mentioned throughout my life and throughout the course of other people's lives who are in this room. That First Nations people get free housing, that we don't pay taxes, get free post-secondary education, that we're always protesting, we're drumming, we're corrupt, all of those different things, right? So. And I think I could answer to each one of these. Like I was complaining in a way to my office staff this morning that I paid $20,000 in taxes last year and have probably done so for the last few years. I have a mortgage as well, status Indian person. When I graduated from university, I had a $30,000 student debt load, and I'm sure that's the same with a lot of other students here. Have protested and drummed a bit, so I'm not going to deny that. But with regards to the idea that we hear a lot in the news about band chiefs and councils being corrupt, it's proven that just a very small minority of bands have a little bit of trouble with their auditing and their finances, but most of them are fine. They have to turn in audits every year and they turn out fine, but the few that don't, it seems like the media really center in on those. So there's just some of the myths and stereotypes that were mentioned in this video, and that I'm sure we've shared in different conversations. And Duncan's going to touch on some of these now, so we'll invite Duncan to come up at this time. And he's going to talk about the issue, what it takes for Aboriginal people to take the news, or to make the news, and it'll touch on some of the myths and stereotypes hereafter. And afterwards, we're going to have a discussion, so I don't know if you'd like to take the lead at that as an experienced journalist. But we'll see how it goes. So, okay, Duncan McHugh, everybody.
Thank you so much for spending the evening to come out and talk about this, because it's an important conversation, and I know that everybody's lives are busy, and so I raise my hands to those of you that have come here tonight just to share in the conversation. And I want to really make sure that we leave some time for some comments at the end, because it's pretty thought-provoking stuff what we just watched, and I'm sure you've all got some comments. I do want to just start off by acknowledging that we're on Coast Salish territory. Yesterday I took my son skiing up at Mount Seymour, and there was a beautiful view looking up Indian Arm, and I took an Instagram shot and tweeted it out and said, Tsleil-Waututh territory, traditional territory, looking pretty sharp today, or something like that. And then of course, sure enough, I get like all these angry tweets from Squamish people saying, "Hey, whose traditional territory is that?" So it's easier just to say Coast Salish territory when you're downtown. How many people, when you watch that movie, how many people think that the news media have played a role in contributing to some of those stereotypes? I'm just curious. Okay. So I better go out the back door real quick here. So that's, I share your opinion, and that's what I want to just spend a few minutes talking about, and really focusing in on the news media in particular, and some of the problematic ways that we've portrayed Aboriginal people, and often in newsrooms, in fact, aren't even aware of. About 5 or 6 years ago, the CBC, I've been working with CBC for 15 years, and we gathered in Regina to try to figure out, the CBC is quite aware that we're not doing the greatest job when it comes to Aboriginal representation on the network. And so we gathered about 5 or 6 years ago to say, okay, how do we fix this? How do we get better programming when it comes to Aboriginal issues? How do we get more Aboriginal people in our newsrooms? And I met this very nice elder, and he pulled me aside, and he said, he said, what do you do? And I said, I'm a reporter. And he said, oh. And he said, you know what it takes, and this is the article that William was referring to. You know what it takes if you're an Aboriginal person and you want to make it into the news? I said, no. He said, well, you got to be one of the 4 Ds. And I said, what are the 4 Ds? He said, well, you're not going to make it into the, this was his 4 Ds rule about how Indians get in the news. He said, you're not going to make it into the news if you're an Indian unless you're drumming, unless you're dancing, unless you're dead, or unless you're drunk. And I've been a reporter for a while, and I could pull out some stories that I've done that don't involve drumming, dancing, dead, drunk Indians. Or I could find other stories in our newspapers and our TV newscasts that don't necessarily, that involve a repatriation of sacred artifacts from a museum or a graduation ceremony. So I can find stories like that, but with elders' words, you hear what they're saying, and you go off and you ruminate about it. And I started to think about what he had told me. And that's when I started to take a look at some of the 4 Ds that he had mentioned. This is, and I just want to run you through some of these. This is a shot from the CBC.ca News Aboriginal Backgrounder, and it looks like an Edward Curtis photo, if you ask me. This is an interesting one. It comes from a protest. And there was no story that came along with it, and the cut line of the protest was a protest on the National Day of Action on the steps in the front of the Peace Tower on Parliament Hill. Canada cares less and less about the third world living conditions faced by many of its native peoples, protesters said. And I guess when I see that photo, the first question that leapt into mind is, what does that have to do with third world living conditions? This was the head of the front page of the Globe and Mail. Really fascinating story about how military intelligence has infiltrated and is looking at native groups. Don't know what that photo has anything to do with this really important story, other than the fact that perhaps CSIS is infiltrated the Payoff highway. I don't know. This is a story from a large gathering on the steps of the legislature in BC. Again, there were 3,000, 4,000, 5,000 people there. This was the photo that made it on the front page of the Times Colonist. Of course, if you're drumming, that's an excellent way to make your way into the news. This is a shot from the Aboriginal Day of Action. This is a shot from the story about Native residential school abuse. This is a shot about missing and murdered Native women. This is a shot about education funding that ran in a news story. This is a shot from the Picton, coverage of the Picton trial. Of course, dead Indians. Here's an interesting experiment. If you Google dead and Aboriginal, or dead and Indigenous, or dead and Native, and plug it into your Google News, see how many stories pop up in the past week or two. This is just a selection from the past month that I just happened to grab. 4,000 Aboriginal children died in residential schools. This is a story from Manitoba. A man came in to get health treatment, waited 40 hours in the hospital, and then was released, where he died. There was an inquest into that. This is a story of a second-degree murder charge of an Aboriginal woman. More children dying, this time in foster care in Alberta. And of course, accidents. We know that in this country, unfortunately, Aboriginal people die in disproportionate amounts, particularly from accidents, and there's no question that when they die, they make the news. The drunken stereotype, something that was mentioned quite a bit in that video, I actually think that it's on the wane when it comes to media coverage, which I think is a good thing. However, there are an awful lot of stories that relate to substance abuse. This one in particular is one that sticks out in my mind, and it was an awful and a tragic story. I wouldn't argue for a second that it's something that shouldn't be covered, but that said, when we are continually supplying Canadians with these kinds of images of Aboriginal life in this country, based on the narrative frames that reporters have chosen, then we begin to see these kinds of myths and stereotypes reinforced, and they become, I like the term that the professor used there, they become common sense in Canada, that these kinds of things exist. Daniel Francis, if you're looking for more reading on this, Daniel Francis is a good place to start. In The Imaginary Indian, he argues that the Indian began as a white man's mistake and became a white man's fantasy. Another book, if you want to get more into the media, that I'd highly recommend is Seeing Red. And the authors of that book argue that the mainstream press has expressed ideas and representations that are supportive of the thinking that gave rise to treaties and residential school, and the short answer to that is yes. And what they argue is that, in fact, the media has played a role that we've propped up, and I say we, I'm a member of the media, that we've propped up ideas that Canadians have about land dispossession, about assimilation, and that those have become accepted norms in Canada, and that the media has, whether wittingly or unwittingly, played a role in propping up those norms. I would argue, and it was very interesting that the video talked about the letter to the editor. And the letter to the editor that they were referring to was a letter to the Nanaimo Daily News. I don't know, I see some people nodding, and it caused quite a furor, and folks in Nanaimo, at the Nanaimo First Nation, were deeply upset by that letter. And they gathered in front of the Nanaimo Daily News, about 100 people, and said this has to change. I agreed with them. I do agree with them sincerely that it does have to change, and the media has to start moving beyond the narrative frames that we've chosen, that we see Aboriginal life through. We need to move beyond this notion of victims. We need to move beyond the notion of warriors that we so regularly continue to report on. It could be a bit of a downer tonight if we were just to focus on that, and so I just want to take a couple minutes and just say there is some good news. Here's the good news. Wob Canoe. Wob Canoe is going to fix everything. But there are a growing number of Aboriginal reporters in our newsrooms, and that we still have a long way to go, absolutely, in terms of getting some sort of equity, if you will, in newsrooms across this country, but it's increasing, even since I've been a reporter in the past 15 years. And Aboriginal reporters bring a broader perspective. Diversity in general in your newsroom brings a broader perspective about what makes news. They bring a wealth of contacts and experience, and they also bring perhaps a different narrative frame to the newsroom. And so I'm really pleased when I see young Aboriginal reporters who are making their way into the business right now. I think Indigenous media, independent Indigenous media, is making a huge difference. And so APTN, the Aboriginal People's Television Networks, shows like First Story, I raise my hands to them. I happen to be involved in the mainstream media, but it's really, really important that we have an independent Indigenous media who are telling our own stories. I'm part of a great project at the UBC School of Journalism where we're focusing, it's a course called Reporting in Indigenous Communities, and I have a great joy of getting to spend 4 months with students, sharing with them in a safe environment and with partners, First Nation partners here in the Lower Mainland. We send them out, throw them out, get their hands dirty so that they can learn and discuss amongst themselves how to understand the protocols, some of the culture, some of the practices, that they can adapt their reporting style to, so that they can mesh these two often competing, clashing newsroom and Indigenous cultures. And so I'm hopeful. We're a third year into the pilot project now, and it's turned out great. This is the last year we focused on water, and these are the kinds of stories that the students turned up. And so I think it's the kind of thing that newsrooms can change. They just need to start focusing on how to make change. There are other cool projects going on across the country. In Northern Ontario, Journalists with Human Rights is training citizen journalists in Indigenous communities like the Attawapiskat, which was mentioned in the video there. And I think that is a project that has all kinds of potential. And then CBC, I have to put in a plug for, we launched CBC Aboriginal, and so in December, and I hope some of you have seen it either on Facebook or on our CBC website. It's a small first step, but I think we're doing a better job of getting some important Indigenous content out there, and it shows other mainstream media organizations that this is just like sports, just like business, just like fashion, you know, all the kinds of things, that Aboriginal issues are important and something that we need to focus on in this country. Because this is the letter from the Nanaimo Daily News that caused all the fuss, and it's not okay. And so I was glad to see 100 people standing up at the Nanaimo Daily News and telling them that it's not okay. It's the dark ages is what it is, that letter got through a publisher and an editor and was printed. And it's time to change. The media needs to change. It's not freedom of speech. It's ignoring, or at least it's ignoring our responsibility as journalists to act ethically and responsibly when it comes to reporting on Indigenous issues. I do think that there are all kinds of stories like this out there, and so if the media start to think critically about ourselves and what we do, that we'll see more and more stories like this. So Jimmy Gwitch, thank you very much for taking a little bit of time, and have we got some time for questions for you? Yeah, cool. So it'd be great if we could just have a chinwag about some of the things that you've seen and some of the thoughts you may have. William, do you want to come up and answer questions too? Do you want to come up and answer questions? And Klahani has a microphone. So.
I think so. Hi. You got a question?
Hi. First of all, I want to thank you, William and Duncan, for the presentation. Like yourselves, acknowledge the Coast Salish territory. And the question I have for you, Duncan, is the term Aboriginal and how it's used in the media, perhaps even by yourself and or other colleagues generally, and how that obscures the perception and the local knowledge and understanding of people on the ground. So if you could explore that a little bit. Thank you.
So the advice I give and to my students in my class, and then the website that I run for reporters as well, which is called Reporting in Indigenous Communities. The advice I give, and I think it's pretty standard, any Aboriginal person would recognize that when you're addressing somebody that you meet, we don't walk down the street and go, "Yo, Indigenous," you address them by their tribe or their nation, right? I mean and so I urge reporters to use that same protocol to call someone Cree or Dene, because otherwise it reinforces this homogenization of Indigenous cultures, when in fact we know that we're all distinct and very different. But and there's always a but there, right? There does need to be a term for Indigenous / Aboriginal / Native / First Nations peoples collectively. There needs to be a term when you're referring to people who are of Indigenous culture. Drew Hayden Taylor calls it the NAFNIP issue, right? Are you Native? Are you Aboriginal? Are you Indigenous, First Nations? And that can be a real challenge for a reporter. You get many reporters saying, okay, well, I can't call them Indians, but there are times, like legally, you should call them Indians, and you need to be precise about that kind of thing. Likewise, there are many Indigenous people who are frustrated with the term Aboriginal now and what that connotates, but Aboriginal is in Section 35 of the Constitution. So, so it's a challenge for a reporter which term to use, whether to capitalize Aboriginal or not capitalize Aboriginal, and there's there's no kind of standard on that at the moment. There are many different style guides, and journalists are using different. But I always advise my students and other reporters, use the nation first if you can.
This has been an issue on the Simon Fraser University campus as well, and we've had sort of discussions about it, and the odd heated discussion here and there about what's proper terminology to use. So I created this, I think, 3-page paper, and it's posted on our office website about a little bit discussing that topic and why different offices around the university use different terminology. And it's gotten some good comments, and I try to be respectful. And I think the main things are it depends on the context. So when I'm talking, with my office staff, some of who are Aboriginal, we kind of use the term Indian there, and have no qualms about using that term. Other times, we're around people who prefer the term Indigenous, so we're okay to use it in that context. We find a lot of times students from different nations like to be called by their nation, whether it's Ojibwe, Anishinaabe, Cree, Coast Salish. So a couple of points that I pointed out in that paper are to try to find out what people prefer to be called, and also to be respectful of what people don't mind being called or wish to be called. So that's the two main points in the paper that is on our office website. So yeah, so it can be sort of a contentious term, and even the term Indigenous now, a professor was commenting to me, well, it sort of seems to add an extra layer now to all of these different terms, and but I've grown comfortable using it in different settings, and others have as well. So, but I guess that's the key: find out what people want to be called, and be respectful of what they wish to be called, and which terminology they wish to use. So,
yeah. Do you think it's time to have an Aboriginal pundit on Thursday night, CBC, the National? Because, I think the thing about Wub Canoe is when we heard him defending, I can't remember his name, but...
Joseph Boyden.
Thank you.
The Arenda.
Yeah, so much was brought up that we don't hear, and we
Yeah.
got to hear things discussed. And often, on Thursday nights, we hear all sorts of political debates and everything. And I find it strange. Like, it still sort of harkens back to the history of being an apartheid system that we're still excluded from this conversation.
Mm-hmm. So you're referring specifically to the National, and for those of you that don't watch the National, there's a panel every Thursday night that Peter Mansbridge has on politics in Canada, which has pretty much, until recently, has been unfailingly white. We're having a panel on next Tuesday on Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and Wab and Gabrielle Scrimshaw will be on that panel along with Paul Martin. So I think people at the National certainly recognize that there needs to be a broader voice. What I haven't seen happen is an Aboriginal pundit who comes in and doesn't discuss necessarily Aboriginal issues.
Well, all issues are Aboriginal.
Pardon me?
I said all issues are Aboriginal.
Sure, absolutely. But whether it's treaty rights or residential schools or the Arenda, and that will be an interesting next layer. One of the challenges there for Aboriginal folks is that there are so many demands upon those who, for our scholars and our artists and all kinds of things, that it's a challenge to market yourself as a guy or a gal who has a full toolkit, who can be there to talk about interest rates. Is that there are so many needs upon our people that do have the capacity. Is that the best value and use of their time to be talking about interest rates on the National? I don't know. I don't know. But it'll be great when we get to that point, I think, that we have Aboriginal experts who are talking about talking about housing and the Ukraine and all kinds of other things.
As far as Aboriginal issues go, how would you say that if you were trying to get the media involved in your organization or your university or things that you're doing, how would you phrase it in such a way that it comes out sort of a more positive light, rather than, starkly and sort of got a sort of a resistance to it? How would you?
So sorry, how would you frame it if you're trying to get the media to come to your
to get to the media
event?
without the drumming and being
get some drumming and dancing. That'll work every time. I get some students who sometimes misinterpret me when I give my line about drumming and dancing, which I got from the elder, because my point is not that we're proud of our drumming and our dancing.
Yeah, I think it makes us unique. And
yeah,
it makes
absolutely.
us,
and
it gives us our culture.
And it's part of our ceremony, which is a daily affirmation of where we come from and what we've been passed on, right? So I don't tell journalists that they should just no drumming and dancing, period. But they do need to ask the people that are at the and frankly, Aboriginal activists are great, right? They know what makes the media, so they bring their drums and they're and so it's this symbiotic relationship. But what I do tell them is that when you're at the Downtown East Side Women's March on February 14th, ask them what that song is that they keep singing over and over again, where it comes from, what the if there's lyrics to it, what nation it came from, all those kinds of things. Ground the ceremony and the dance and the drumming and dancing in what it is to us, to Aboriginal people. And then by all means, you have full license to use it. But your question is, how do you frame it so that the media gets interested but it has a positive spin? That's a challenge, to be honest with you. And so every newscast, every newspaper, every radio newscast, they all are keen to have positive stories, because we all get the emails and viewer mail and all that kind of stuff that says, oh, I'm so tired of all the death and destruction on the news, and why are you guys always so negative? And so we try to have the little positive stories, and that's a good way to, so for example, again, using the National, we have something called Only in Canada, which is where, Peter gets to chuckle at the end of the story and pitch the weather declare. But that's a good thing. It's a great way to fit a positive story into a newscast, and you can approach different media outlets saying, hey, this would make a great positive Only in Canada story, for example. But, there's the but again, we also know what it is that attracts eyeballs. We know intimately because we measure it second by second on the TV. We follow the clicks, and I swear to God, second by second on the online. And so watching CBC Aboriginal has actually been quite fascinating, because I can see what it is that Aboriginal folks largely are clicking on when it comes to news. And I'll tell you what, in the past 2 months, what have been the biggest hitters, it's been stories about missing and murdered Aboriginal women. Aboriginal people, we've surveyed our Aboriginal audience, and we know that the constant 9 out of 10 Aboriginal people say they want more positive stories in the news, but they're not necessarily, they're like everybody else. They're clicking at stuff that is shocking. They're clicking on stuff that is disturbing. They're clicking on stuff that makes them angry. There's nothing like the story about a woman up in Prince George who was refused smudging. She couldn't smudge her apartment. That thing, was one of our highest rated stories. So negative news, unfortunately, is what Aboriginal audiences included. That's what they click on in big numbers. So. That said, and then again, the Walk for Reconciliation, British Columbians voted it as the #2 story of 2013. So that's a positive thing. Christy Clark was #1.
Thank you very much for sharing your knowledge and experience. I was wondering about the development of counter-narrative, not about outside the media umbrella, because I find that there are a lot of whether we use the word multiculturalism or whether we use face-to-face conversation, because as a non-Indigenous person, I find when I look at the media, for example, I see racism not against only First Nation, but also against all people who are not English, for example. And like today now, the Russians have to hide behind the curtain. So it's kind of generalizing everybody. But what I find is that the main thing is to work with people to people, in the sense, for example, I work in the library, so there are a lot of international students and students who want to look for books. So I say, okay, let's start with First Nation book, or people want to go to work to Africa and come. So I say, first go and spend 6 months in First Nation before you go, so that you, as a non-Indigenous, you also know the rest of Canada. Because I think the main thing is, there is, for example, for South Asian, there is a craze of butter chicken now, right? So everything South Asian is butter chicken, or as you said, there is also the dinner, the dressing. I think there's another D you can mention, the dressing part, right? So I think the media, I've been looking at the news for the last 20 years I've been here. I don't see much hope in changing much, but it can be done through a lot of conversations. And like I also debate the question, who is Mother Earth? Because for many people, Mother Earth is either Queen Victoria or Queen Elizabeth, because it's always in your pocket, the backside of the coin, right? So
I think counter narratives are super important, and it's fantastic when we have bloggers who are putting out their truths to counteract independent media. But again, I'll go to stats, which is that with regard to Twitter, for example, when news breaks, people are, yes, they're following their Twitter feeds to see what happens. They may be going to counter-narrative bloggers, for example, but 90% of the things that get tweeted are articles that come from what they call legacy news sources. So that would be, CBC and CTV and Global, Vancouver Sun, Globe and Mail, that kind of stuff. Because your average news consumer doesn't necessarily have time to wade through 15 bloggers and try to discern the truth. They rely to a certain degree on reporters to do some of that fact checking, to do some of that analysis, and that's why the mainstream media articles are continually being passed around and read. As much as some people are frustrated with them, they do act as a real point of a center point, if you will, a focal point for people. That's why it's called the popular media.
Could you talk about the payoff for those in the media who rely or use or deploy stereotypes, and the recipients, the audience, and that relationship? Like, why are stereotypes? Why do they get so much traction?
So here's and that's a great question. Here's an interesting conundrum for that I'll just throw out to you. I'm curious what you guys think. In my class 2 weeks ago, I had a photographer from a mainstream newspaper here in Vancouver came in, and he does fantastic work. And he talked to my students about some of his experiences covering First Nations issues, and showed us some pictures and how to take a great news photo. But he gave an example. We got to talking about stereotypes, and he gave the example of if he's on an assignment, he's doing a profile, let's say, on the chief of the Squamish Nation, and the business, some of the business developments that are going on at the Squamish Nation. And he's got 10 minutes with the chief because, he's the chief's busy, and they've got to try to make the newspaper that night. So he's got 10 minutes with the chief, and he said the chief gives you two options. He could be sitting behind his desk in the band office, or he's happy to go out and stand by the river wearing some regalia. Which option would you choose if you've only got one photo to tell the story that goes with the profile? And so I throw that out to you guys. Which option would you choose if you were the photographer? Well, yeah, and so there's an interesting question. What's the content of the story? That should be driving it, but you know.
Well, there's that concept of the collective unconscious, and I have a strong belief that Canadians love the image that they create for themselves.
Mm-hmm.
But the reality is that this is a colonizing nation. Very, very well off country, built on its natural resources. And one of the if Canadians haven't defined their actual identity, a lot of it has been in opposition to the American identity. So whatever we are, we're not like that. We're nice. Mm-hmm. So I think there's a big collective denial by Canadians to say, you know what, the fact that a First Nations people here is homeless, doesn't have a place to live, is leading all these social indicators. If you believe that all those things are simply a First Nations person's fault, that if they're just unruly, don't know how to behave, all those different things, if you believe all that's true, well, there's a word for that, right? Or else I think you have to be able to speak to or admit that the colonizing process has been really effective, and it's been largely on the, to the extreme non-benefit of First Nations people. So I think, I just think that people want to they want to see positive stories. They want to go down to the gallery, go down to a positive event. But the idea that you want to sort of touch on the really tough issues, missing and murdered women, any other demographic, there'd be a huge formal investigation, legislation, all the different institutions would be hard at work. But the actual fact is that race is still the primary, barrier for a lot of people. So it's, I think it's really, really deeply, to me, race and gender are the two oldest ones as far as human beings go. So I think it's really challenging for mainstream Canadians to think that this sweet, lovable place could be like Africa, like these places in the Middle East, like all these other places. But in fact, it's more subtle because it hasn't happened in actual conquest and actual slavery and things like this. It's been institutionalized, so it's ongoing. So I think people have a real hard time wrapping their minds around those types of ideas.
And to go to your question about stereotypes, why do they exist in the first place? It's because of, the example that I used with the chief. Do you get him in the regalia or do you get him behind the desk? It's about shorthand. People trying to figure it out quickly what this is about. And that's the same silly reason that they put feathers behind, when the anchor is sitting there and it's an Indigenous story, they put a feather up because people kind of get it. It's a feather, okay. People choose feathers for their logos for the same reasons, right? Aboriginal people choose feathers for their logos for the same reason. So stereotypes are there's a valid shorthand reason that we all use stereotypes on a daily basis. The problem is when the stereotypes are continually reinforced and get divorced from the truth, right? And that's become the issue. But to use photos as an example, I am a TV reporter. What does an Indigenous person look like? And if you've only got one picture to take, and people have to get it. Do you need the feather in there? Do you need that little swath of the Haida, thing that McHugh? Because otherwise, I just look like some guy standing up here behind an Apple computer, and is he really talking about Aboriginal stuff? He doesn't know. I don't know if he looks Asian. He could be Hawaiian. So this thing, somehow indigenizes it, and those are the kinds of split decision making that a lot of news photographers use when they're choosing their photos at the end of the day. Unfortunately, when you see them over drumming and drumming and drumming and drumming and drumming and drumming and drumming, it gets to be a negative stereotype.
Speaking of which, I would add to the 4 Ds, 5, I guess, would be demanding.
Demanding, yeah, absolutely, demanding Indians.
Oh, okay. Hi, greetings. I'm Quetzalcoatl, Patricia Kelly, and thank you, Duncan. I did come in partway through your presentation, but thank you very much. I am Coast Salish, Stalo. Speaking of preference for recognition and identity, so welcome to my territory, to all of you. And my question, is a good lead-off with your discussion in terms of colonization and decolonization. So my point, I have lots of questions, but the one that I pick at this moment is, how are you addressing the decolonization through your teachings of up-and-coming journalists? One of your students happens to be, coming to me a lot lately. And
Do you think she's decolonized?
I'm just wondering, there's Indigenous, non-Indigenous, again, another preference if there's an overall way to identify us. It's Indigenous on the global. And then that's due to our international protection. The legal identification that you pick in terms of Aboriginal, yeah, I like that. And, identifying respectfully with each nation, that's great. So this is a part of decolonization, right? But I want to know deeper on a level of the stigma we talk about. How would you be able to teach decolonization, if that's a proper word, as opposed to colonization? Because we're all in this together now, and yet we have our specific blood ties that are ancient and thousands of years old. So how do we come to that reciprocal respect finally? Take a look at the battle going on in Canada right now over pipelines, as an example. We're depicted in a very negative light overall anyways. But why can't we take, say, for example, that constitutional aspect, Section 35, the affirmation and recognition of our Indigenous inherent rights here, and write from that as opposed to any other way, right? Because, if we've as journalists obviously have to be careful in law. And so if we don't live up to the law, then we're against the law, which we're breaking the law. We're consistently breaking the law every single day on every medium, to my knowledge. Right across the board, Indigenous peoples are not properly recognized and affirmed. Look at the treaties right across Canada, are not being implemented. They're not being enforced. They're not recognized by Canada. In fact, right now, Harper government is drawing back on any transfer payments, those meager transfer payments, because of the oil and gas emerging. Well, I say to the media, help us out. Help us to come to the recognition and affirmation in your discussions. That's what I'm really looking for on a national and international level. Having been a cash cow in the legal industry as a part of Canada's systemic and impoverishing laws. We need help as Indigenous people now. Together, we're in this together. I say we have one mother, and that's Mother Earth. That makes all of us brothers and sisters. So really, Where are we pointing our questions? What kind of questions should we be asking now? So I'd like to leave that with you, and if you feel like responding to any of it, I'd be glad to hear. And maybe, I'd like to have a brief chat with you after the session and discuss, newspaper coverage to what's really said in the interview and what gets printed. Like how do we come to that decolonization process and procedure? Because that's a positive, that's an affirmation. Because I did hear you say, and I agree with you, that there's a denial and a negation going on in Canada. How can we turn that around? Because the media would play a very key role. I know individually on Facebook, right across Canada, we can be our journalists and our own journalists. Take a look at New Brunswick as an example. It was hot off the press on my little friend's computer as it was happening. So we can be journalists. It's what we put into the system as well. We each have that opportunity not only to receive information now, but we can also give it. So thank you for listening. And there you go. Osiam. Lahai.
Rich, and I'm happy to carry on that conversation with you afterwards. But just to play, there were many things you said there, which are, but to pluck out one, you asked about how do you teach decolonialism to journalists. It's tough because I don't know about you guys, but me personally, I'm on a daily journey to decolonize myself. I was just giving an interview today to a student group from Cap College who were doing something on oral history, and they were asking me about oral histories and how they were communicated in the media. And it occurred to me as I was answering this interview that I'm a product of the Canadian school system, just like probably most of you here are, where you learn to read and write and do all that kind of thing. And so I constantly, as an Indigenous person, have to remind myself on a daily basis of the importance of the oral tradition in our communities, and my grandma and my mother-in-law and all those people that are passing on those traditions. But I grew up reading and writing, and I'm in a business where I write for a living, and so I'm personally struggling with decolonization on a daily basis. I think the pressure to colonize is huge on Indigenous and non-Indigenous people, so that's a challenge. But ultimately it's about knowing your history, and I think that's the starting point, is that we need to share with non-Indigenous students and journalists, and Indigenous students for that matter, the history of this country, and give them the best taste that we can to make them critical thinkers and to be able to, when they go out there on their own, whether it's in the arts or in journalism or in their own personal lives, that they're thinking critically about all the messages that are around them. So.
For those two photographs, did you get any of the photographs? Because I was wondering, one photograph on the table would represent assimilation, and the other photograph would represent kind of ethnic or nationalism. Because I think many times
The photos of the chief, you mean?
yeah.
Yeah, well, but so if you were, I'm assuming that the photo behind the desk would be assimilation.
Well, that's I would. It has some potential of creating, especially if you're in a suit tie.
No.
That you're wearing the English.
And so there would be that would be another interesting conversation to have with folks. If you're wearing a suit and a tie and you're sitting behind a desk, does that mean that you're assimilated?
That's why I didn't wear a tie tonight, folks. So thanks so much. I'm sure we could go on for another hour, but the hour is getting late. So I want to thank everyone for showing up. It's the last in our series, lecture series involving SFU, UBC, the Indigenous Research Institute, etc., our office. So look out for a new lecture series next year, and we'll try to get some other speakers coming and talk about interesting topics. And thanks for Duncan for coming out on a Wednesday night. Thank you very much. Okay?